The grand atrium of Hartwell Industries rose before her like a cathedral of glass and steel, its soaring ceilings adorned with chandeliers that scattered light in 1,000 prismatic fragments across the marble floors. Elena Marquez pushed her cleaning cart through the entrance reserved for service personnel, her rubber-soled shoes making no sound against the polished stone. It was 5:30 in the morning, that liminal hour when the building belonged neither to night nor day, when the executives had not yet arrived to claim their dominion over these halls, and she might move through them as something more than invisible. She had been cleaning these offices for 3 months now, ever since circumstances had conspired to strip away the life she had known and leave her clinging to whatever employment she could secure. The uniform she wore, a shapeless grey smock with the cleaning company's logo embroidered on the breast, hung loose on her frame, disguising the education that still lived in her mind, the languages that still moved on her tongue with the fluency of one who had once translated for diplomats and corporate magnates in rooms not unlike these. But that was before the scandal, before her name had been dragged through the machinery of public opinion and emerged on the other side, unrecognizable and unemployable in the career she had spent a decade building. Now she wielded a mop instead of words, and if there was a certain poetry in the irony, she was too exhausted most days to appreciate it. The work was honest, at least, and there was a strange comfort in the simplicity of tasks that could be completed and measured, floors cleaned, trash bins emptied, surfaces wiped until they gleamed. No one looked at her here. No one saw her. She had become what she appeared to be, merely a woman who cleaned, background noise in the symphony of commerce that played out in these offices each day. The executive floor occupied the 23rd level of the tower, accessible only by a private elevator that required a key card she had been issued with stern warnings about the confidentiality expected of anyone who entered that rarefied space. Elena had nodded and signed the papers without comment, understanding that she was being asked to be deaf and blind to whatever occurred above the 22nd floor, to pass through those offices like a ghost, leaving nothing behind but the scent of lemon cleaner and the shine of properly maintained surfaces. She had seen Mr. Hartwell only once, and that from a distance, a tall figure in an impeccably tailored suit, moving through the lobby with the purposeful stride of a man who had never doubted his right to occupy space in the world. James Hartwell, the CEO and founder of Hartwell Industries, a technology firm that had risen from modest beginnings to become a significant player in the international market. The business journals kept in the waiting areas spoke of him in reverent tones, chronicling his rise from a middle-class background to the heights of corporate success, his innovative approaches to management, his philanthropy. He was 42, unmarried, and frequently photographed at charity galas with beautiful women on his arm who never seemed to last more than a season. Elena had read these articles while eating her lunch in the break room, not out of any particular interest in James Hartwell, but because they were there, and reading was a habit she could not break, even when the material was as shallow as these puff pieces. She had formed no opinion of the man beyond a vague sense that he was like most men of his station, convinced of his own brilliance, comfortable in his power, and likely unaware of the machinery that supported his daily existence. Men like James Hartwell did not think about who cleaned their offices or emptied their trash. She was part of the invisible infrastructure of his world, as anonymous as the electrical wiring in the walls. This morning, as always, she began her work on the 23rd floor with methodical efficiency. The reception area first, where she dusted the sleek desk and the modernist sculpture that stood in the corner like a question mark rendered in bronze. Then the conference room, with its enormous table of polished walnut and the chairs upholstered in leather soft as butter. The windows that lined one wall offered a view of the city beginning to wake below, lights flickering on in offices and apartments, early risers starting their commutes. Elena paused there for a moment, allowing herself this small indulgence, this view that was not meant for her, but which she could steal in these hours before the rightful occupants arrived. She was cleaning the kitchenette when she heard the elevator chime. Her hands stilled on the coffee maker she had been wiping down. No one came up here at this hour. She had been assured of that when she was assigned this floor. The executives arrived no earlier than 8, and it was barely 6 o'clock now. Yet she heard footsteps, the confident tread of expensive shoes on the hardwood floor that bordered the carpeted areas. Elena quickly dried her hands on her apron and stepped back from the counter, making herself small, unobtrusive, hoping whoever it was would not notice her, or if they did, would accept her presence without comment. James Hartwell rounded the corner into the kitchenette and stopped short at the sight of her. He wore running clothes, fitted athletic pants, and a moisture-wicking shirt that clung to his frame, revealing the physique of a man who took his physical fitness as seriously as he took his quarterly earnings. There was a gym bag slung over his shoulder, and his dark hair was damp with sweat. He had clearly come from a workout, probably in the building's private gym on the 12th floor that only upper management could access. "Oh," he said, his expression registering surprise. "I didn't realize anyone would be here this early." Elena lowered her eyes respectfully, as she had learned to do in this position. "I apologize, sir. I'll finish this area later. I didn't mean to disturb you." No, it's fine," he said, moving past her to the refrigerator. "Don't let me interrupt your work. I just need to grab some water." She nodded and turned back to the coffee maker, intending to complete her task quickly and remove herself from his presence. But she could feel him watching her as he drank from the bottle he had retrieved, and there was something in the quality of his attention that made her self-conscious in a way she had not been in months. Since taking this job, she had become accustomed to being overlooked, to moving through spaces without leaving an impression on the people who occupied them. But James Hartwell was looking at her with the frank curiosity of someone encountering an anomaly in his otherwise predictable environment. "You're new," he said after a moment. It was not quite a question, but his tone invited confirmation. 3 months, Elena replied, keeping her voice neutral and her eyes on her work. "And you start this early every day?" "Yes, sir. The floors need to be finished before the staff arrives." He made a non-committal sound and took another drink of water. Elena could feel the conversation hovering between them, threatening to extend itself beyond these pleasantries into something more substantial. She did not want that. She wanted him to finish his water and leave, to allow her to return to the blessed anonymity that had become her refuge. But James Hartwell seemed disinclined to cooperate with her wishes. He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms over his chest, in a posture that suggested he was settling in for a chat. "That must be quite a schedule. What time do you have to wake up to get here by this hour?" 4 o'clock, sir." His eyebrows rose. "That's dedication. Or necessity, I suppose." Eleanor did not respond to this. The distinction between dedication and necessity seemed irrelevant when the outcome was the same. She was here, doing this work, regardless of whether she chose it or was driven to it by circumstances beyond her control. "Do you have far to come?" he asked. "To get here, I mean." "About an hour on the bus, sir." "An hour," he repeated, and there was something in his tone that might have been sympathy or might have been mere acknowledgement. It was difficult to tell with men like him, whose expressions of concern for those below them on the economic ladder were often performative rather than genuine. "That's quite a commute." Eleanor finished wiping down the coffee maker and moved to the sink, where a few mugs had been left the previous evening. She began washing them with focused attention, hoping that her obvious engagement in her tasks would signal to him that she was not available for extended conversation. But James Hartwell remained where he was, watching her with that unsettling curiosity that refused to classify her as simply part of the scenery. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated, the mug in her hand suspended under the running water. Giving her name felt like a small surrender of the protective anonymity she had cultivated. But refusing would be rude, potentially insubordinate, and she could not afford to lose this job. "Elena, sir." "Elena," he repeated as if tasting the name. "That's pretty." Is it Spanish? Yes, sir. Are you from Spain or Mexico originally? But I've been in the United States for many years. He nodded, apparently satisfied with this information. Elena dried the mugs and placed them in the cabinet, then gathered her cleaning supplies, preparing to move to the next area on her schedule. But before she could leave, James Hartwell spoke again. "Your English is excellent," he said. "No accent at all, really. Did you learn it in school?" The question was innocent enough, but it touched a nerve that Eleanor had thought sufficiently calloused to be painless. Her English was excellent because she had a master's degree in linguistics, because she had spent years perfecting her command of multiple languages, because she had once been hired precisely for her ability to move seamlessly between English, Spanish, French, and Portuguese, facilitating communication for executives who needed to negotiate deals across international borders. But she could not say this to James Hartwell. That life was over, buried under the weight of a scandal that had nothing to do with her competence and everything to do with being in the wrong place at the wrong time, with trusting the wrong person, with naively believing that truth would protect her when power had already decided on a different narrative. "I've always been good with languages, sir," she said instead, offering him a truth that was incomplete but not false. "That's a valuable skill," he said, and there was genuine appreciation in his voice. "Languages, I mean. I've always envied people who can pick them up easily. I barely scraped through my high school Spanish, and my French is non-existent." Eleanor managed a small smile, the polite expression of someone who is being gracious about a compliment. "Everyone has different strengths, sir." "True enough," he agreed, finishing his water and tossing the bottle into the recycling bin with practiced aim. "Well, I should let you get back to work. I need to shower and get ready for an early meeting anyway." "Of course, sir." He moved toward the door, then paused and looked back at her. "Elena?" "Yes, sir." "Thank you for doing what you do. I know it's not glamorous work, but it matters. The office wouldn't function without people like you keeping everything running smoothly." Elena inclined her head in acknowledgement, uncertain how to respond to this expression of gratitude. It was more than most executives would offer, and yet there was something faintly condescending in it too, in the acknowledgement that her work was not glamorous, as if she might not have noticed this herself. But she accepted the thanks with the same professional courtesy she brought to all her interactions with the building's occupants, and James Hartwell left the kitchenette, his footsteps receding toward what she assumed must be his private office. She finished her work on the 23rd floor in a state of mild perturbation, her thoughts circling back to the encounter despite her efforts to dismiss it as insignificant. There had been something in the way James Hartwell looked at her, something that suggested he had actually seen her rather than simply noting her presence the way one might notice a piece of furniture. It was unsettling, this visibility, and she found herself hoping it would not become a pattern. The last thing she needed was the CEO's attention, however well-meaning it might be. Attention led to questions, and questions led to lies or truths she could not afford to tell. By 7 o'clock, her shift was complete, and Elena made her way back to the service elevator, pushing her cart ahead of her. The building was beginning to fill with the early arrivals, junior staff members eager to demonstrate their dedication by beating their superiors to the office. They passed her in the hallways without acknowledgement, intent on their own concerns, and she was grateful for their indifference. This was how it should be. This was how she could survive, by being unremarkable, forgettable, just another face in the crowd of service workers who kept the machinery of corporate life running smoothly, while remaining beneath the notice of those who benefited from their labor. The bus ride home took her through neighborhoods that shifted from commercial to residential, from prosperity to poverty, the buildings growing shorter and shabbier as she moved away from the gleaming downtown core. She lived in a small studio apartment in a building that had seen better days, the kind of place where the landlord fixed nothing unless legally compelled, and the neighbors minded their own business with a religious fervor born of shared precarity. It was not much, but it was hers, paid for with the money she earned pushing a mop and emptying trash cans, and there was a certain dignity in that, in being beholden to no one, in owing nothing she could not pay. She slept fitfully through the morning, her body accustomed now to this inverted schedule but never fully comfortable with it. When she woke in the early afternoon, she made herself a simple meal and sat by the window, watching the street below and thinking about nothing in particular. This was her life now: work, sleep, the small routines that filled the hours between. It was not the life she had imagined for herself when she was young and ambitious, when she believed that talent and hard work would be sufficient to build a career and a future. But it was the life she had, and she had learned to accept it with what grace she could muster. The following morning, she returned to Hartwell Industries at the same early hour, prepared for another day of the same routine. But when she reached the 23rd floor, she found James Hartwell already there, seated in the kitchenette with a cup of coffee and what appeared to be a sheaf of documents spread out on the small table. He looked up when she entered, and a smile crossed his face. Not the distant, polite smile of an executive acknowledging service staff, but something warmer and more genuine. "Good morning, Elena," he said. "I didn't mean to commandeer your workspace. I'll get out of your way in a moment." "Good morning, sir. Please take your time. I can start elsewhere." "Actually," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him, "would you mind sitting for a minute? I wanted to ask you something." Elena felt a flutter of anxiety in her chest. This was exactly what she had hoped to avoid: further interaction, further questions, further risk of exposure. But she could hardly refuse a direct request from the CEO. She moved to the table and sat down, keeping her posture formal, her hands folded in her lap. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday," James Hartwell began, his eyes on her face with that same intent curiosity she had found so disconcerting. "About your language skills. It got me wondering, what else can you speak besides English and Spanish?" The question was unexpected, and Elena found herself answering before she had time to consider the wisdom of revealing more about herself. "French and Portuguese, sir. And a little Italian, though I'm not as fluent in that." His expression brightened with what appeared to be genuine delight. "That's incredible. 4 languages. That's not something you pick up casually." "I've always enjoyed studying languages, sir. It comes naturally to me." He leaned back in his chair, studying her with an expression that was part assessment, part fascination. "You know, I have a problem that someone with your skills might be able to help me with. We have a Brazilian delegation coming in next week for contract negotiations, and our usual translator has fallen through, family emergency. We've been scrambling to find someone who can handle not just Portuguese, but also the technical terminology of our industry. It's a tall order, and the agencies we've contacted haven't been able to provide anyone on short notice." Elena's heart began to beat faster. She could see where this was going, and the prospect filled her with equal parts longing and dread. To use her languages again, to engage her mind in the work she had trained for, it was tempting beyond measure. But it was also dangerous. Translation work meant visibility, meant being in rooms with powerful people, meant potential recognition by someone who might remember the scandal that had ended her career. "I'm sure you'll find someone, sir," she said carefully. "The agencies are usually very resourceful." "Maybe," he said, "but here's the thing. I have someone right here who can do the work. You, if you're interested, that is." She met his eyes, trying to read the intention behind the offer. Was this a genuine proposition, or was he testing her somehow, playing a game she did not understand? "Sir, I'm a cleaner. I'm not qualified to—" "You speak 4 languages," he interrupted. "That qualifies you better than most people I could hire, and I'm willing to compensate you well for your time. Very well, in fact." He paused, and a smile played at the corners of his mouth. "I'll tell you what. I'll give you my salary for the week if you can translate this meeting for us." The words hung in the air between them, absurd and impossible. His salary for a week would likely equal months of what she earned pushing her cleaning cart through these offices. It was a joke, obviously, the kind of extravagant gesture wealthy people made when they wanted to emphasize their generosity while knowing the offer would never be accepted. But there was something in his expression that suggested he was at least partly serious, that he genuinely wanted her to say yes. Elena opened her mouth to refuse, to explain all the reasons why this was impossible, why she could not step back into that world even for a week, even for money that would change her life. But before she could speak, James Hartwell leaned forward, his expression earnest now, stripped of its playful edge. "Look," he said, "I realize this is unusual. You're probably thinking I'm crazy for asking my cleaning person to step in as a translator. But I've built this company by recognizing talent wherever I find it, and you have a skill we need. If you can help us through this negotiation, I'll be genuinely grateful. And I'm serious about the compensation. I'll pay you what I would pay a professional translator for this kind of high-stakes work. Probably more, actually, because you'd be saving us in a pinch." She wanted to say no. Every instinct she had developed over the past year told her to refuse, to protect the quiet anonymity she had worked so hard to maintain. But there was another voice too, quieter but more insistent, that whispered about the rent she struggled to pay, about the debt still hanging over her from the legal fees she had incurred, defending herself against accusations that had ultimately been dropped, but not before they had destroyed her reputation. About the possibility of using her education and training again, even if only for a brief moment. "I would need to know more about the context," she heard herself saying. "The technical terms, the background of the negotiation. I couldn't walk in cold and expect to do adequate work." James Hartwell's face lit up with a smile that transformed his features, making him look younger and less formidable. "Of course, I can give you all the briefing materials we've prepared. You'd have several days to review them, and we'd do a practice run before the actual meeting. Make sure you're comfortable with everything." Eleanor nodded slowly, feeling as if she was standing at the edge of a precipice, about to step off into unknown space. "I need to think about it, sir." "Fair enough," he said. "But Elena, think seriously about it. This isn't charity. I need someone good, and I have a feeling you're better than you're letting on." She stood up, needing to put distance between herself and this conversation, this temptation. "I'll let you know by tomorrow. If that's acceptable, that's fine. Take the time you need." Elena left the kitchenette and returned to her cleaning cart, her hands shaking slightly as she pulled on her rubber gloves and picked up her spray bottle of glass cleaner. James Hartwell remained at the table, returning to his documents, apparently content to let the matter rest for now. But the offer hung in the air like a presence, impossible to ignore, demanding consideration. She spent the rest of that day in a state of internal turmoil, her mind returning obsessively to James Hartwell's offer, even as her hands went through the familiar motions of her work. The executive offices gleamed under her ministrations, surfaces wiped to perfection, floors polished until they reflected the overhead lights like still water. But she barely noticed the results of her labor, so consumed was she by the decision that loomed before her. That evening, after her shift ended and she had returned to her small apartment, Eleanor sat at the narrow table that served as her dining area, workspace and desk, and forced herself to think through the situation with the methodical logic that had once been her professional trademark. She took a sheet of paper and drew a line down the middle, creating 2 columns. On the left, she wrote the reasons to accept, on the right, the reasons to refuse. The left column filled quickly. The money, certainly. Even a fraction of what James Hartwell had suggested would be transformative for her current circumstances. It would allow her to pay down her debts, perhaps even save something against the future that seemed so uncertain now. Beyond the financial considerations, there was the prospect of using her skills again, of engaging her mind in work that required thought and expertise rather than merely physical endurance. For nearly a year, she had felt her education and training atrophying from disuse, her languages growing rusty, except for the Spanish she spoke with her mother during their weekly phone calls. This would be an opportunity to exercise those abilities, to prove to herself that they still existed beneath the grey uniform and the exhaustion. The right column was shorter, but more weighty. There was the risk of recognition, though after a year, and given how thoroughly she had altered her appearance and circumstances, it seemed unlikely that anyone would connect Elena Marquez, the cleaning woman, with Dr. Elena Marquez Whitmore, the translator whose face had been splashed across business journals when the scandal broke. She had let her hair grow long and kept it pulled back in a severe bun, wore no makeup, dressed in shapeless clothes that disguised her figure. The woman she had been, polished, confident, visibly successful, bore little resemblance to the person she had become. More troubling was the prospect of re-entering a world she had been forced to leave, of walking back into boardrooms and negotiations where one misstep could have consequences far beyond her control. The scandal that had ended her career had taught her how quickly professional relationships could turn toxic, how easily a reputation could be destroyed by association with the wrong person. She had been guilty of nothing more than trusting her then-husband, of failing to notice that he was using her access to confidential translation sessions to conduct insider trading. When the investigation had swept through the firm where she worked, she had been caught in its net despite having no knowledge of his activities. The charges against her had ultimately been dropped for lack of evidence, but the damage had been done. No one wanted to hire a translator who had been investigated for corporate espionage, regardless of the outcome. She sat at that table for hours, the paper before her, the two columns staring back at her like accusers demanding a verdict. Outside her window, the city darkened and came alive with artificial light, the streets filling with people returning from work, heading to dinner, living lives that seemed uncomplicated in comparison to her own. Elena watched them and thought about the person she had been before everything fell apart. The woman who had moved through the world with confidence, who had believed that competence was a shield against misfortune. That woman seemed like a stranger now, separated from her present self by an unbridgeable gulf of experience. But perhaps, Eleanor thought, that was precisely why she should accept James Hartwell's offer. Not because of the money, though that was important, and not because of the chance to use her skills, though that mattered too, but because refusing would be an admission that the scandal had broken something essential in her, that she had lost not just her career but her courage, her willingness to take risks, her belief in her own capabilities. If she turned away from this opportunity out of fear, what did that say about who she had become? By the time she finally went to bed, Elena had made her decision. She would accept the offer, but she would do so with clear boundaries and careful protections. She would insist on being paid in advance, so that if something went wrong, at least she would have something to show for the risk. She would request complete anonymity, no photographs, no inclusion in any public-facing materials about the negotiation, and she would be honest with James Hartwell about her limitations, making it clear that while she was competent in the languages required, she was not a specialist in technology sector terminology and could not guarantee perfection. The next morning, when she arrived at Hartwell Industries, Elena found James Hartwell once again in the kitchenette, though this time he was dressed in his usual business attire, a charcoal suit that fit him with the precision of custom tailoring, a white shirt, a silk tie and a shade of blue that matched his eyes. He looked up from his phone when she entered, and his expression brightened in a way that made her suddenly conscious of her own appearance, of the shapeless uniform and the comfortable but unflattering shoes. "Eleanor," he said, rising from his chair with the instinctive courtesy of someone well-bred, "have you thought about my offer?" "I have, sir." She set down her cleaning supplies and faced him squarely, willing her voice to remain steady. "I'm willing to help you, but I have some conditions." He gestured to the chair across from him. "Please, sit. Tell me what you need." Eleanor sat, folding her hands on the table before her. "First, I need to be paid in advance, not your entire salary for the week." She allowed herself a small smile at this absurdity, but a rate appropriate for professional translation services based on the time commitment involved. I can provide you with industry standard rates if you're unfamiliar with them. I'll pay you $10,000, James Hartwell said without hesitation. Half in advance, half upon successful completion of the negotiation. Is that acceptable? Elena felt the breath catch in her throat. $10,000 was more than she made in 6 months of cleaning. It was enough to clear her debts entirely and still have money left over. It was so generous as to be almost suspicious, and she found herself searching his face for signs of an ulterior motive. But he looked merely expectant, waiting for her response, apparently seeing nothing unusual in the figure he had named. "That's very generous, sir," she managed. "It's what the work is worth," he said simply. "What else?" "I need complete anonymity. No photographs, no mention of my name in any materials related to the negotiation. As far as anyone needs to know, you hired a translator through an agency, someone whose identity isn't relevant to the proceedings." James Hartwell frowned slightly at this. "May I ask why? I would think you'd want to use this as an opportunity to build your professional reputation, get references for future work." Elena had anticipated this question and had prepared an answer that was true enough to be credible without revealing too much. "I left the translation field under difficult circumstances, sir. Personal issues that made it impossible to continue in that career. I've rebuilt my life since then, and I'd prefer not to risk disrupting that stability. This is a one-time arrangement, not a return to my former profession." He studied her for a long moment, and Elena had the uncomfortable sensation of being assessed, of having layers of protective concealment stripped away by the intensity of his regard. But finally he nodded. "All right, I can respect that. You'll be listed in any internal documents as coming from an agency, and I'll make sure no photos are taken during the sessions. Anything else?" "I'll need access to all relevant briefing materials immediately so I can prepare adequately. And I'd like to do at least one practice session before the actual negotiation to ensure I'm familiar with the technical terminology and the flow of discussion. Of course, I'll have my assistant compile everything you need and deliver it to you today. And we can schedule a practice session for tomorrow afternoon if that works for you. The Brazilian delegation arrives on Monday, so we have just under a week to get you ready." Elena nodded, feeling the weight of commitment settling on her shoulders like a physical presence. "Then I accept, sir. Thank you for the opportunity." James Hartwell extended his hand across the table, and after a moment's hesitation, Elena took it. His grip was firm and warm, and he held her hand a fraction of a second longer than was strictly necessary for a professional handshake. When he released it, there was a smile on his face that suggested he was pleased not just with securing a translator, but with something else she could not quite identify. "Thank you, Elena. I have a feeling this is going to work out better than either of us expects." She returned to her cleaning duties after that conversation, but her mind was already shifting gears, preparing for the work ahead. By the end of her shift, a package had been delivered to the cleaning staff break room with her name on it. A thick envelope containing what appeared to be hundreds of pages of briefing materials, technical specifications, contract drafts, and background information on both Hartwell Industries and the Brazilian company with whom they were negotiating. There was also a note in James Hartwell's handwriting, giving her his direct phone number and instructing her to call if she had any questions. Elena took the package home and spent the afternoon and evening immersed in the materials, her mind awakening to the familiar challenge of technical translation. The Brazilian company, she learned, was a major manufacturer of component parts used in renewable energy systems, and Hartwell Industries was hoping to secure a long-term supply agreement that would support their expansion into green technology. The negotiations would be complex, involving not just price and delivery terms, but also questions of quality control, intellectual property, and potential future collaboration on research and development. As she read, Elena made notes in the margins, highlighting terms she would need to verify, flagging sections that would require particularly careful translation. It was work she had done 1,000 times before, and the familiarity of it was both comforting and painful, a reminder of what she had lost and what she might have been if circumstances had been different. But she pushed those thoughts aside and focused on the task at hand, determined to prove to herself, if to no one else, that she was still capable of professional excellence. The practice session the following afternoon took place in a small conference room on the 23rd floor, a space Eleanor had cleaned countless times but never entered as anything other than service staff. Now she sat at the polished table with James Hartwell and his chief operating officer, a sharp-eyed woman named Margaret Chen, who regarded Eleanor with frank skepticism. "You're sure about this?" Margaret asked James, not bothering to lower her voice despite Elena's presence. "We're putting a multi-million-dollar negotiation in the hands of our cleaning woman." "I'm sure," James said calmly. "Elena has the skills we need, and I trust her to do the work competently. Let's run through the opening statements and see how she handles them." For the next 2 hours, they simulated the negotiation, with Margaret playing the role of the Brazilian delegation and speaking in Portuguese that was technically correct but heavily accented. Elena translated smoothly, moving between English and Portuguese with a fluency that gradually erased the skepticism from Margaret's expression and replaced it with something approaching respect. She caught nuances of meaning that a less skilled translator might have missed, and she was able to adapt on the fly when Margaret threw in unexpected questions or shifted the direction of the discussion. By the end of the session, even Margaret was nodding in approval. "All right," she said to James, "I'll admit I'm impressed. Where did you say you found her?" "I didn't," James replied with a slight smile. "But I'm glad I did. Elena, that was excellent work. I think you're going to do just fine on Monday." Elena felt a flush of pride that she had not experienced in months, a reminder of what it felt like to be good at something, to have her competence recognized and valued. "Thank you, sir. I'll continue reviewing the materials over the weekend to make sure I'm as prepared as possible." "I know you will," he said. "In fact, why don't you plan to come in over the weekend if you need to? I'll make sure you have access to the building and to my office. You can use the space to work, and if you have questions, I'll be available by phone." It was an extraordinary offer, to be given access to the CEO's private office, to be trusted with that level of proximity to confidential materials and spaces. Elena understood that it represented a significant expression of faith in her discretion and professionalism, and she accepted it with the gravity it deserved. "I appreciate that, sir. I may take you up on it." When she left the building that afternoon, Elena felt as though she were walking several inches taller than she had in months, her spine straight, her step purposeful. She caught her reflection in the glass doors of the building and barely recognized herself, not because of any change in her appearance, but because of something in her expression, a light in her eyes that had been extinguished for so long she had forgotten it could be rekindled. She was, for this moment at least, not just a cleaning woman, but a professional, someone with valuable skills and important work to do. It was a dangerous feeling, she knew, this resurgence of pride and purpose, because it made her vulnerable again to disappointment, to failure, to all the things that had brought her low before. But she allowed herself to feel it anyway, because the alternative, remaining numb and resigned, suddenly seemed like a worse fate than the risk of being hurt again. She spent the weekend in James Hartwell's office, a space that was both elegant and surprisingly personal. There were books on the shelves, real books, not just the business bestsellers one might expect, and photographs on the credenza that showed a younger James with people who appeared to be family, though no recent pictures suggested he was close to anyone now. The desk was massive, the chair behind it leather and comfortable, and Elena allowed herself the small transgression of sitting in it while she worked through the briefing materials, imagining what it must feel like to occupy this space as a right rather than a privilege temporarily granted. She worked through both days, breaking only for simple meals she had brought with her, absorbed in the task of preparing herself for the negotiation ahead. By Sunday evening, she felt confident in her command of the material, in her ability to handle whatever the Brazilian delegation might throw at her. She left James Hartwell's office as she had found it, no trace of her presence remaining except a note she left on his desk, thanking him for his trust and assuring him she would not disappoint him. Monday morning arrived with a weight of significance that made Eleanor's hands tremble slightly as she dressed. She had purchased at considerable expense from her limited savings a professional suit in charcoal grey, modest but well cut, and a pair of low heels that were comfortable enough for a long day but elevated enough to be appropriate for a business setting. When she looked at herself in the small mirror in her apartment, she saw a woman who might have been her former self, professional and competent, someone who belonged in boardrooms and negotiations. It was a disturbing vision and a reassuring one all at once. She arrived at Hartwell Industries at 8 o'clock, entering through the main lobby rather than the service entrance for the first time in 3 months. The security guard who had waved her through countless mornings barely glanced at her now, not recognizing the cleaned-up professional woman as the same person who pushed a cleaning cart through these halls in the pre-dawn darkness. Elena signed in at the reception desk and took the executive elevator to the 23rd floor, her heart beating fast with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. James Hartwell was waiting for her in the reception area, and the expression on his face when he saw her made Elena suddenly self-conscious. He looked startled, as if he were seeing her for the first time, his eyes moving over her in a way that was not quite professional, but not quite improper either. There was appreciation in his gaze, certainly, but also something else, a kind of recognition, as if he had suspected all along that the cleaning woman was more than she appeared and was now having that suspicion confirmed. "Elena," he said, recovering his composure quickly, "you look very professional. Are you ready for this?" "As ready as I can be, sir." "Good." He gestured toward the large conference room where the negotiation would take place. "The Brazilian delegation should be here within the hour. Margaret and I will handle most of the discussion, but we'll be relying on you to ensure nothing is lost in translation. If you need clarification on anything, don't hesitate to ask. This is too important to risk misunderstandings." Elena nodded, following him into the conference room, where Margaret Chen was already setting up materials at the head of the table. The COO looked up as they entered, and her eyes widened slightly at the sight of Elena in professional attire. "Well," she said after a moment, "I have to say, you clean up nicely." "Thank you," Elena replied, refusing to be embarrassed by the backhanded compliment. She had been in enough high-stakes professional environments to know that being underestimated could be an advantage, that people revealed more when they thought their words were not being carefully evaluated. The Brazilian delegation arrived at precisely 9 o'clock, a punctuality that suggested seriousness and respect for the proceedings. There were 4 of them: the CEO of the manufacturing company, his chief financial officer, a technical specialist, and their lawyer. They greeted James Hartwell and Margaret Chen with professional courtesy, then turned their attention to Elena as James introduced her simply as our translator for this negotiation. D. The lead negotiator, a man in his 50s named Roberto Ferreira, addressed Elena in Portuguese. "It's good to have someone who speaks our language properly. Too often these negotiations suffer from inadequate translation. You are Brazilian?" "Mexican," Elena replied in Portuguese, "but I've worked extensively with Brazilian companies and am familiar with the terminology and communication styles of your business culture." Roberto nodded, apparently satisfied. "Then we should have no misunderstandings. That's good. Misunderstandings cost money." The negotiation began, and Elena slipped into the familiar rhythm of simultaneous translation, her mind splitting its focus between listening to one language and speaking another, capturing not just the words, but the tone and nuance of each speaker's meaning. It was demanding work, requiring intense concentration, but it was also exhilarating in a way she had nearly forgotten. This was what she had trained for, what she was good at, and to be doing it again after so long felt like coming home after a long exile. As the morning progressed, Elena became aware that James Hartwell was watching her with an attention that went beyond merely checking whether she was doing her job adequately. There was something in his gaze that made her conscious of herself in a way she had not been since entering the conference room, something that suggested his interest in her was not purely professional. But she pushed the thought aside, focusing on the work at hand, on ensuring that every word spoken on both sides of the negotiation was rendered accurately and completely in the other language. They broke for lunch at noon, and the Brazilian delegation was escorted to a private dining room where a catered meal had been arranged. Elena, uncertain whether she was expected to join them or to take her lunch separately, hesitated in the conference room until James Hartwell returned and solved her dilemma by taking her arm and guiding her toward his office. "You've earned a break," he said. "Come on. I had my assistant order lunch for us. We can eat in private and you can tell me how you think it's going." In his office, with the door closed and the city spread out below them through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Elena accepted the salad and sandwich that had been left on his desk and allowed herself to relax slightly from the intense concentration of the morning. James Hartwell poured them both water from a carafe and sat down across from her, regarding her with that same assessing expression she had noticed in the conference room. "You're not just good," he said after a moment. "You're exceptional. Where did you learn to translate like that?" Elena had known this question would come eventually, and she had prepared an answer that was true without being complete. "I studied linguistics in graduate school and worked as a professional translator for several years before my circumstances changed." "What changed them?" he asked, and there was genuine curiosity in his voice rather than mere polite interest. She hesitated, weighing how much to reveal, but something in his expression, in the way he was looking at her as though she were a person rather than merely an employee, made her want to be honest with him, at least partially. "I was married to someone who turned out to be dishonest in his business dealings. When his activities came to light, I was caught in the investigation because I had done translation work for some of the companies involved. The charges against me were dropped, but my reputation was destroyed. No one wanted to hire a translator who had been investigated regardless of the outcome. I lost everything: my career, my marriage, my home. This job cleaning offices was all I could get." James Hartwell was quiet for a long moment, his face thoughtful. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle. "I'm sorry that happened to you. It's unjust to be punished for someone else's crimes. Justice and fairness aren't always the same thing," Elena said with a slight shrug. "I've learned to accept that." "Maybe you shouldn't have to accept it," he said. "Maybe you deserve a second chance to have the career you worked for." Elena met his eyes and saw something there that alarmed her, not pity, which she could have dismissed, but something warmer and more personal, a regard that had nothing to do with her professional skills and everything to do with the woman he was beginning to see beneath the cleaning woman's disguise. It was dangerous, this attention from James Hartwell, because it threatened the careful boundaries she had constructed around her life, the walls that kept her safe from further hurt and disappointment. But it was also tempting, because it had been so long since anyone had looked at her the way he was looking at her now, as though she mattered as something more than a pair of hands that cleaned floors or a voice that translated words. The afternoon session of the negotiation proved more challenging than the morning had been. The Brazilian delegation, having established the basic parameters of the potential agreement, began probing for weaknesses in Hartwell Industries' position, testing the limits of what James and Margaret were willing to concede on pricing and delivery schedules. Elena found herself navigating not just linguistic differences, but cultural ones as well. The Brazilian negotiators employing a style that was simultaneously more personal and more aggressive than what their American counterparts expected. She worked to convey not just the content of their statements, but the emotional undertones, the subtle signals that indicated when they were posturing versus when they had reached their genuine boundaries. Roberto Ferreira, the lead Brazilian negotiator, was particularly skilled at this dance of advance and retreat, his manner friendly and warm, even as he pushed relentlessly for better terms. At one point, he made what appeared to be a casual comment in Portuguese about the possibility of taking their business elsewhere if they could not reach satisfactory terms, phrasing it as mere speculation rather than a threat. Helena, translating, preserved both the content and the deliberate ambiguity of his statement, watching James Hartwell's expression as he absorbed the implications. James responded with equal subtlety, acknowledging the possibility while making it clear that Hartwell Industries had other potential partners as well, though they preferred to work with a company of Roberto's reputation and expertise. Helena translated his words into Portuguese, matching his tone of respectful firmness, and saw Roberto's eyes gleam with appreciation at the skillful parry. "Your translator is very good," Roberto said in Portuguese, addressing James but looking at Helena. "She understands not just our words but our meaning. That is rare." "I'm fortunate to have her," James replied when Helena had translated, and there was something in the way he said it that suggested he meant more than mere professional appreciation. The negotiation concluded at 5 o'clock with the major terms outlined but not yet finalized, both parties agreeing to reconvene the following morning to work through the remaining details. The Brazilian delegation departed with expressions of satisfaction at the progress made, and Margaret Chen began gathering up the materials scattered across the conference table with brisk efficiency. "That went well," she said to James. "Better than I expected, actually. Helena, you did excellent work today. We couldn't have managed without you." "Thank you," Helena replied, feeling the exhaustion that came from hours of intense concentration beginning to settle into her bones. Her voice was hoarse from speaking, her mind fuzzy from the sustained effort of moving between languages and cultures. "You should go home and rest," James said, noticing her fatigue. "Tomorrow will be just as demanding. But before you go..." He pulled an envelope from his briefcase and handed it to her. "The first half of your payment, as we agreed." Eleanor took the envelope, feeling its weight in her hand. $5,000. More money than she had held at one time in over a year. It felt surreal, almost dangerous, as though accepting it would somehow make everything that came after more complicated. But she had earned it, and she needed it, so she tucked it into her purse and thanked him with as much composure as she could muster. "I'll see you tomorrow morning," she said, preparing to leave. "Helena." James's voice stopped her at the door of the conference room. She turned back to find him watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "Would you have dinner with me tonight? Nothing to do with work, I promise. Just, I'd like to talk with you more, away from all this." The invitation hung in the air between them, weighted with implications that Helena understood all too clearly. This was not a professional courtesy, not a thank you for your work gesture. This was something else, something personal, something that crossed the careful boundaries she had tried to maintain. Every sensible instinct she possessed told her to refuse politely, to keep their relationship strictly professional, to protect herself from the complications that would inevitably arise if she allowed it to become anything more. But she heard herself saying, "All right, where should I meet you?" James smiled, and there was relief in his expression as well as pleasure. "There's a small Italian place a few blocks from here. Quiet, good food, nothing fancy." "Would 7 o'clock work?" 7 o'clock, Helena confirmed, and left before she could change her mind. She went home and stood in her small apartment, the envelope of money on the table before her, and tried to understand what she was doing, what she was allowing to happen. James Hartwell was attracted to her, that much was obvious, and had been since their first real conversation in the kitchenette. And if she was honest with herself, she was attracted to him as well, though she had tried to suppress the feeling, to dismiss it as inappropriate given their respective positions. But what was their relationship now? She was no longer simply his employee, the invisible woman who cleaned his office. The work she had done today had established her as a professional, someone with valuable skills and expertise. Did that change the ethical calculations, make it permissible to accept his invitation? Elena changed out of her professional suit and into a dress she had not worn in months. Simple but flattering, appropriate for a casual dinner, but nice enough to signal that she was taking the occasion seriously. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw someone she barely recognized. Not the cleaning woman, not the disgraced translator, but someone in between. Someone who was beginning to emerge from the protective shell she had constructed around herself after the scandal. The restaurant James had chosen was indeed small and quiet, tucked into a side street away from the main thoroughfares of downtown. It was the kind of place where people went for intimate conversations rather than to be seen, and Elena appreciated his discretion in selecting it. He was already there when she arrived, seated at a corner table with a glass of wine before him, and he rose when he saw her approaching with an old-fashioned courtesy that reminded her he came from money, from a world where manners were taught from childhood. "Thank you for coming," he said as she sat down across from him. "I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure either," Elena admitted. "This is complicated." "It doesn't have to be," James replied, though his expression suggested he knew he was simplifying. "I'm just a man having dinner with a woman he finds interesting. Whatever else we are professionally doesn't have to intrude on that." But of course it did intrude, Elena thought. Their professional relationship was the foundation of everything between them. The reason they had met, the context that shaped every interaction they had. To pretend otherwise was to ignore the fundamental imbalance of power and circumstance that colored every word they spoke. Yet she found herself wanting to believe him, wanting to accept the fiction that they were simply two people sharing a meal, unencumbered by all the complications that reality imposed. They ordered dinner and wine, and as the evening progressed, Elena found herself relaxing into the conversation in a way she had not anticipated. James was an attentive listener, asking questions that suggested genuine interest rather than mere politeness, and he responded to her answers with insights that revealed a thoughtful intelligence beneath the corporate executive exterior. He told her about building his company from nothing, about the risks he had taken and the failures he had survived, about the loneliness that came with success when you reached a level where few people treated you as a human being rather than as a means to an end. "Everyone wants something," he said at one point, swirling the wine in his glass. "Money, connections, opportunities. After a while, you stop being able to tell whether people like you for yourself or for what you can give them. It's isolating in a way I didn't expect when I was younger and ambitious. I thought success would make everything easier, but in some ways, it's made everything more complicated." Eleanor understood what he was saying, though from the opposite direction. Her own fall from professional success had taught her how quickly relationships evaporated when you no longer had status or resources to offer. The colleagues who had been friendly when she was a respected translator had melted away when the scandal broke, unwilling to risk association with someone under investigation. Even her family had been distant, uncomfortable with the shame she had brought on them through her marriage to a criminal, though they had softened somewhat once the charges against her were dropped. "Isolation takes different forms," she said, "but I think I understand what you mean. When I lost my career, I also lost my identity. I had to figure out who I was when I wasn't the successful translator, the competent professional. It turns out I'm still working on that question." James reached across the table and took her hand, the gesture surprising her with its directness. "I think you're someone who's been knocked down but refuses to stay down. Someone who takes work as a cleaner and does it with the same professionalism and dignity you brought to translation." "That's not nothing, Elena, that's character." She felt tears prick at her eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. It had been so long since anyone had seen her clearly, had recognized the effort it took to maintain her dignity through circumstances that could so easily have destroyed it. She blinked the tears back and squeezed his hand briefly before withdrawing her own, needing to maintain some distance even as she felt the walls around her heart beginning to crack. "Tell me something," James said after a moment. If you could have anything, if circumstances were different, and you could remake your life however you wanted, what would you do? Elena considered the question, turning it over in her mind. A year ago, she would have said without hesitation that she wanted to return to her career as a translator, to rebuild her reputation and prove that she was more than the scandal that had destroyed her. But now, after months of living a simpler life, stripped of ambition and professional striving, she was not sure. There was something to be said for the straightforward honesty of manual labor, for work that did not require you to navigate complex power dynamics or risk your reputation with every decision. Yet she could not deny the exhilaration she had felt today, using her mind and her skills again, being valued for her expertise rather than merely tolerated as necessary infrastructure. I think I would want what everyone wants, she said finally, to do work that matters, to be seen and valued for who I am, to build a life that feels authentic rather than like a series of compromises forced by circumstance. But I'm not sure how to get from here to there, or if it's even possible. What if I told you it might be possible? James leaned forward, his expression intense. What if there was a way for you to have the career you trained for without the risk of your past coming back to haunt you? Elena felt her heart begin to beat faster. What are you suggesting? Work for me, not as a cleaner, as a translator. Hartwell Industries does business internationally, and we're expanding into new markets. I need someone I can trust, someone with your skills and discretion. You could work remotely if you wanted, or from a private office where you wouldn't have to interact with anyone who might recognize you from before. I can offer you protection, anonymity, and compensation that reflects your actual value. It was a generous offer, almost impossibly so, and Elena's first instinct was to refuse it. Accepting would mean becoming dependent on James Hartwell's goodwill, would create a professional relationship that would inevitably be complicated by whatever personal attraction existed between them. It would mean taking another risk, trusting someone again, opening herself up to the possibility of being hurt or betrayed or disappointed. She had spent a year building walls to protect herself from exactly those possibilities, and here he was, asking her to tear them down. I need to think about it, she said, though the words felt inadequate to the weight of what he was offering. Of course, James replied. I'm not asking for an answer tonight, but Elena, I want you to know, this isn't charity. I'm not offering you this because I feel sorry for you or because I'm attracted to you, though I'll admit that I am. I'm offering it because you're good at what you do, and I need that expertise in my company. Everything else is secondary to that. But was it? Elena wondered as they finished dinner and parted ways outside the restaurant, James insisting on putting her in a taxi, despite her protests that she could take the bus. Was his offer truly based on her professional competence, or was it colored by his attraction to her, by some desire to rescue her that had more to do with his own ego than with her actual needs? She did not know, could not know, and the uncertainty troubled her as the taxi carried her through the darkened streets toward her apartment. The following morning, Elena returned to Hartwell Industries and translated the second day of negotiations with the same professionalism and skill she had brought to the first. The remaining details were hammered out, compromises reached, terms finalized. By 3 o'clock, the contract was ready for signing, and Roberto Ferreira was shaking hands with James Hartwell and Margaret Chen, expressing satisfaction with the agreement and complimenting them once again on their choice of translator. If you ever need work, Roberto said to Elena in Portuguese, my company would be happy to hire you. You have a gift for this. Elena thanked him, but did not commit to anything, aware of James listening to their exchange, even though he could not understand the words. When the Brazilian delegation had left, and Margaret had departed to begin implementing the agreement they had reached, Elena found herself alone with James in the conference room, the silence between them heavy with unspoken questions. You did exceptional work, James said. I meant what I said last night about wanting to hire you on a permanent basis. Have you thought about it? I've thought about little else, Elena admitted. But I'm still not sure it would be wise. Why not? She gestured between them, encompassing all the complications of their situation in a single movement. Because of this. Because of whatever is happening between us that isn't strictly professional. Because accepting your offer would mean trusting you in a way I'm not sure I'm ready to trust anyone, especially not someone who has power over my livelihood. James was quiet for a moment, his expression troubled. I understand, and I respect that. But Elena, I want you to know, if you decide to work for me, our professional relationship would be exactly that. Professional. I wouldn't use your employment as leverage for anything personal. Whatever happens or doesn't happen between us personally would be completely separate from your work. Can you really promise that? Elena asked. Can anyone promise that when there's attraction and power imbalance and all the messiness of human feeling involved? No, he said after a moment, and she respected his honesty. I can't promise it with absolute certainty, but I can promise to try, and I can promise that if I fail in that effort, you would be protected. In your contract, in your compensation, in every way I can think of to ensure you're not vulnerable. Elena walked to the window and looked out over the city, thinking about the choice before her. She could return to her small apartment and her job as a cleaner, safe in her anonymity, protected by her invisibility. Or she could take this risk, accept James Hartwell's offer, and see whether it was possible to reclaim some part of the life she had lost. Both choices carried costs. Safety meant stagnation, meant resigning herself to being less than she was capable of being. Risk meant vulnerability, meant opening herself up to all the ways things could go wrong. But it also meant possibility, potential, the chance to be more than she had been. She turned back to face James, decision crystallizing even as she formed the words. I'll accept your offer, but with conditions. I want a contract that specifies my role, my compensation, and my protections. I want it in writing that our personal and professional relationships are separate, and that any changes in the former cannot affect the latter. And I want the option to terminate my employment at any time without penalty if I feel the situation has become untenable. James nodded slowly. I'll have my lawyers draw up a contract that includes all of those provisions. Anything else? Yes. I don't want to start immediately. I need time to prepare myself mentally for this transition, to figure out how to be a translator again after so long away from the work. Give me 2 weeks. 2 weeks, James agreed. And Elena, thank you for trusting me enough to try this. She left Hartwell Industries that afternoon with the second half of her payment, $10,000 that would transform her immediate circumstances, and a promise of employment that could transform her future. The money she deposited in the bank, watching the numbers in her account balance shift from dire to manageable, with a sense of disbelief that refused to solidify into certainty. This could all still fall apart, she reminded herself. Nothing was guaranteed, nothing was permanent. But for now, for this moment, she allowed herself to feel something dangerously close to hope. The 2 weeks Eleanor had requested passed in a strange suspension of time. She continued working her cleaning shifts, but now with the knowledge that they would soon end, that she was cleaning these offices for the last time. Her supervisor accepted her resignation with equanimity, accustomed to high turnover in the cleaning staff, and did not ask questions about where she was going or what she planned to do next. Elena was grateful for this lack of curiosity, for the ability to slip away from this chapter of her life without having to explain herself or justify her choices. She used her evenings to prepare for her new role, refreshing her knowledge of technical terminology, reviewing contracts and business documents, rebuilding the professional expertise that had atrophied during her months away from the field. It was like exercising muscles that had gone slack from disuse, painful at first, then gradually easier as memory and skill reasserted themselves. She also bought new clothes appropriate for a professional environment, investing some of her payment from the negotiation in building a wardrobe that would allow her to present herself as the competent translator she was, rather than the struggling cleaner she had been. James Hartwell called her twice during those 2 weeks, ostensibly to discuss details of her upcoming employment, but really, Elena suspected, to reassure himself that she had not changed her mind. She was touched by his attention even as she maintained careful boundaries, refusing his invitations to dinner or drinks, insisting that they keep their interactions professional until she had actually begun working for him. He accepted her conditions with good grace, though she could hear the disappointment in his voice when she declined his overtures. On her last day as a cleaner, Elena moved through the offices of Hartwell Industries with heightened awareness, noticing details she had overlooked in the routine repetition of daily work. The way morning light slanted through the windows on the east side of the building, warming the marble floors. The sound her cart made, rolling over the threshold between carpet and hardwood. The chemical smell of the cleaning products she had used every day, so familiar now that she barely noticed it, except in this moment of conscious farewell. She had spent 3 months as invisible infrastructure in this place, and now she was leaving that role behind to become something else, someone else. It felt like a death and a rebirth all at once, the ending of one identity and the assumption of another. When her shift ended and she turned in her supplies for the last time, Elena changed out of her uniform in the staff bathroom and left the building in the professional clothes she would wear to work from now on. It was a symbolic transformation, she knew, an external change that did not necessarily reflect any internal reality, but symbols mattered, and she needed this ritual of crossing over from one life to another to make the transition feel real. The following Monday, Elena returned to Hartwell Industries, not through the service entrance, but through the main lobby, and took the executive elevator to the 23rd floor, where a small office had been prepared for her. It was nothing grand, just a desk, a computer, bookshelves, and a window that looked out over the city, but it was private and professional, a space that was hers. Her contract lay on the desk, signed by James and awaiting her signature, and she read through it carefully before adding her name to the document that would bind her to this company and to whatever future this choice created. James appeared in her doorway as she was arranging her few personal items on the desk. "Welcome," he said, officially this time. "How does it feel?" "Strange," Elena admitted. "Like I'm playing a role, rather than actually living my life. I keep expecting someone to realize there's been a mistake and tell me I need to go back to pushing a cleaning cart." "No mistakes," James said firmly. "You earned this position with your skill and your work. You belong here, Elena. I need you to believe that." She wanted to believe it, wanted to accept his confidence in her as justified rather than as kind fiction. But belief was not something that could be commanded or reasoned into existence. It would have to grow slowly, proven through time and experience, built on the foundation of successful work and professional competence. For now, she would act as though she belonged here, and perhaps eventually the acting would become reality. Her first weeks in her new position were both exhilarating and terrifying. James gave her work translating contracts, correspondence, and technical documents, projects that required her full expertise and attention. She worked long hours, driven partly by professionalism and partly by the need to prove to herself that she could still do this work at the level it demanded. Gradually, her confidence returned, the self-doubt that had plagued her beginning to recede. A successful project followed successful project. James kept his promise about maintaining professional boundaries, though Eleanor could feel the effort it cost him. He was never inappropriate, never used his position to press for personal intimacy, but there was something in the way he looked at her during meetings, something in the tone of his voice when he spoke to her, that betrayed feelings he was trying to keep contained. Eleanor found herself caught between relief at his restraint and a growing awareness that her own feelings were becoming increasingly complicated. She was attracted to him, that much she could no longer deny, even to herself. But more than that, she was beginning to genuinely like him as a person, to appreciate the qualities of character that existed beneath the successful executive exterior. He was kind to his staff in ways that went beyond mere professional courtesy. He remembered details about their lives, asked after sick family members, celebrated their achievements both within and outside of work. He was brilliant in business negotiations, but never cruel, always finding ways to structure deals that created value for all parties rather than extracting maximum advantage from others' weaknesses. And he was honest in a way that was rare among men of his wealth and power, willing to admit when he was wrong, to acknowledge his limitations, to ask for help when he needed it. Elena watched him navigate the complex social dynamics of corporate leadership and found herself admiring the grace with which he balanced competing demands and interests. He was not perfect. He could be impatient when people failed to meet his standards, and he sometimes struggled to delegate authority rather than trying to control every detail himself. But his flaws were human and understandable rather than destructive or cruel. The more time she spent in his company, the more difficult it became to maintain the careful emotional distance she had tried to preserve. 3 months into her new position, James invited her to accompany him to an industry conference in Chicago, where he would be giving a keynote address. The invitation was professional. He needed a translator because there would be international attendees and networking opportunities with companies in markets where Hartwell Industries hoped to expand. But Elena could not help feeling that it also represented a test of some kind, a chance for them to spend extended time together away from the familiar structures of the office and see how they navigated that proximity. She accepted, and they flew to Chicago on a Thursday afternoon in March, the city still gripped by winter's tail end, grey and cold under a sky that threatened snow. The conference was being held at a downtown hotel, one of those massive structures that contained entire worlds within itself. Convention spaces, restaurants, shops, even a small art gallery. James had booked them rooms on the same floor, but at opposite ends of the corridor, maintaining propriety while acknowledging their professional partnership. The conference itself was tedious, in the way such events always were, filled with presentations that said little of substance and networking sessions that felt more like performance than genuine connection. But there were also moments of real interest, conversations with executives from companies in Brazil, Japan, and Germany, discussions about potential partnerships that required Elena's linguistic and cultural expertise to navigate successfully. She translated for James during these conversations, facilitating connections that could not have been made without her presence. And she felt the satisfaction of knowing that her work mattered, that she was contributing something of genuine value. On the second evening of the conference, after a particularly long day of presentations and meetings, James suggested they skip the official dinner and find somewhere quieter to eat. Elena agreed, and they walked through the cold Chicago streets to a small French restaurant he had read about, the kind of place that felt like a secret refuge from the corporate world they spent their days inhabiting. Over dinner, their conversation drifted away from business and into more personal territory. James told her about his childhood, about growing up middle class in a family that valued education and hard work, about his father, who had been a civil engineer, and his mother, who had taught high school English. He spoke about the drive that had pushed him to build his company, the need to prove himself that had roots in some complex mixture of ambition and insecurity. And he spoke about loneliness, about reaching 42 and realizing that success had not brought him the satisfaction he had expected, that something essential was missing from his life despite all his achievements. I thought once I had built the company, once I had proven I could do it, I would feel complete, I suppose, he said, his hands wrapped around a glass of wine. But instead I just felt empty. I've been trying to figure out what that emptiness is, what would fill it. Money doesn't. Achievement doesn't. I'm starting to think it's connection, real human connection, that I've been missing. But that's hard to find when you're always wondering whether people see you or just see your money and what you can do for them. Elena understood what he was saying because she had experienced the inverse, the loss of connection when her status and resources disappeared, the realization that many relationships had been conditional on what she could offer rather than who she was. "It's a different kind of loneliness," she said, "but I think I know what you mean. When I lost everything, I lost most of the people in my life too. I learned that very few relationships survive that kind of test. It makes you cautious about trusting anyone afterward." "Is that why you've kept me at a distance?" James asked, his eyes on hers with an intensity that made her heart beat faster. "Because you're afraid to trust me." Elena considered the question, wanting to be honest with him and with herself. "Partly, but also because I'm afraid of what happens if I do trust you and it goes wrong. I've rebuilt my life from nothing once already. I'm not sure I could do it again." "What if it doesn't go wrong?" James leaned forward, his voice low and urgent. "What if I'm not like the people who disappointed you before? What if this, whatever is happening between us, is actually something real and worth taking a risk for?" She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that this attraction they felt for each other could become something substantial and lasting rather than just another disappointment waiting to happen. But belief required a leap of faith she was not certain she could make, a willingness to be vulnerable again after she had worked so hard to protect herself from exactly that vulnerability. "I don't know," she said finally. "I want to believe you, James. But wanting something doesn't make it true or safe or likely to work out the way we hope." He reached across the table and took her hand, the gesture now familiar from that first dinner months ago, but weighted with different meaning in this context. "I'm not asking you to know, I'm just asking you to try, to give this a chance and see what happens. I know I have power over your employment, and I know that makes everything complicated. But Eleanor, I'm falling in love with you. I have been since that morning when you were cleaning the kitchenette and spoke to me with such dignity, despite wearing a uniform that was meant to make you invisible. I saw you then, really saw you, and I haven't been able to stop seeing you since." The words hung between them, irrevocable now that they had been spoken, changing everything even as nothing visible altered around them. The restaurant continued its quiet bustle, other diners engaged in their own conversations, the staff moving between tables with practiced efficiency. But for Eleanor, the world had narrowed to this moment, to James Hartwell's hand holding hers, to the confession he had just made that demanded a response she was not sure she was prepared to give. "I need time," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to think about what you're saying, what it would mean if I said yes." "This isn't simple, James. It can never be simple given who we are and how we met." "I know," he said, "and I'll give you time. I'll give you whatever you need. But please, don't say no just because you're afraid. Fear is a terrible reason to refuse something that could make you happy." They finished dinner in a silence that was not uncomfortable, but charged with awareness, both of them conscious that something fundamental had shifted between them. James walked her back to the hotel through streets now dusted with the snow that had been threatening all evening, their footsteps crunching in the fresh powder, their breath visible in the cold air. At her door, he said goodnight with careful formality, not trying to kiss her, though she could see the desire in his eyes, respecting the space she had asked for, even as it clearly cost him effort to maintain that distance. Elena went to bed that night unable to sleep, her mind circling endlessly around James's confession and her own confused feelings. She was falling in love with him too. That much she could admit now that he had spoken first, now that his vulnerability gave her permission to acknowledge her own. But love was not enough by itself. Love had not protected her from her ex-husband's betrayal, had not prevented the collapse of her previous life. Love could make you vulnerable in ways that were dangerous, especially when complicated by power imbalances and professional entanglements. Yet refusing love out of fear seemed like its own kind of tragedy, a choice to remain safe but diminished, protected but alone. She thought about the woman she had been when she first took the cleaning job at Hartwell Industries, defeated, resigned, willing to accept invisibility as the price of survival. And she thought about the woman she was becoming now, professional, competent, valued for her skills and expertise. James had been part of that transformation, had seen her when she was invisible, and offered her a chance to become visible again. Did that obligate her to him somehow? Or was gratitude just another word for the power imbalance that made any relationship between them ethically complicated? By morning, Elena had reached no conclusion, but she had achieved a certain clarity about what she needed. She needed to know that James loved her for herself, not for some idealized version he had constructed in his imagination. She needed to know that he understood the risks she was taking by allowing herself to love him back. And she needed to know that if things went wrong, she would not be left with nothing again, that she had built enough of a foundation in her new life to survive, even if this relationship failed. The conference ended the following day, and they flew back to their city in a cocoon of mutual awareness and careful courtesy. James did not press her for an answer to his confession, did not try to force the issue or manipulate her feelings. He simply went on being himself, professional, kind, occasionally funny, always attentive without being intrusive. Eleanor watched him and felt her heart opening despite her best efforts to keep it protected, felt her resistance eroding under the steady pressure of his genuine regard. A week after their return, James asked her to dinner again, this time at his home rather than a restaurant. The invitation was clearly significant, a gesture that suggested intimacy and trust, and Elena almost refused out of instinct before forcing herself to reconsider. If she was ever going to give this relationship a chance, she needed to stop retreating from every opportunity for closeness, needed to start taking the risks that love required. James lived in a penthouse apartment with views of the city that were spectacular, even by the standards of someone who had grown accustomed to wealth. But the space itself was surprisingly warm and personal, filled with books and art that reflected genuine interests rather than mere decorative choices. He cooked for her, pasta with a sauce he had learned from his Italian grandmother, he explained, one of the few domestic skills he possessed, and they ate at a small table by the windows, with the city lights spread out below them like a carpet of stars. "I've been thinking about what you said," Eleanor told him as they finished their meal, "about fear being a terrible reason to refuse something that could make me happy. You're right. I have been letting fear make my decisions for too long, so I'm going to try to stop doing that." James set down his wine glass and looked at her with an expression of such hope and vulnerability that it made her chest ache. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm willing to try this, to see where it goes, but I need you to understand what you're asking of me. I need you to understand that if I open myself up to loving you and it goes wrong, it won't just be a broken heart I'm dealing with. It will be my professional life, my financial stability, everything I've worked so hard to rebuild. You have the power to destroy me, James, whether you mean to or not, and that terrifies me." He moved around the table and knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his with a gentleness that contradicted his power and size. "I understand, and I'm terrified too, if I'm honest. I'm terrified of failing you, of disappointing you, of being just another person who hurts you despite meaning well. But Elena, I think we could be good together. I think we could make each other happy in ways that neither of us has been happy in a long time, and I think that's worth the risk, worth the fear, worth whatever complications come with it." Elena looked into his eyes and saw the truth of what he was saying, saw that he was offering her not certainty, which did not exist, but rather his genuine commitment to trying, to doing his best, to treating her heart and her trust as the precious things they were. It was more than she had thought to find again, after everything that had happened to her, and it was enough to make her willing to take the leap he was asking for. She leaned forward and kissed him, a gesture that was both answer and question, acceptance and exploration all at once. James responded with a tenderness that surprised her. his hands cradling her face as though she were something fragile and irreplaceable. His kiss communicating what words could not, that he saw her, valued her, wanted her not as a fantasy, but as the complicated, damaged, resilient human being she actually was. They spent that night together, and in the morning, Elena woke in James's bed feeling both terrified and exhilarated, aware that she had crossed a threshold she could not uncross, that everything from this point forward would be different and more complicated and more vulnerable than it had been before. But she was also aware of a sense of rightness, of being where she was supposed to be with someone who mattered to her in ways that went beyond professional respect or physical attraction. The following months brought their own challenges as Elena and James navigated the complexities of conducting a romantic relationship within the structure of a professional one. They kept their involvement private at first, not wanting to subject themselves to office gossip or speculation, but gradually it became apparent to the rest of the company that something had changed between the CEO and his translator. Margaret Chen, with her characteristic directness, pulled Elena aside one day and asked point-blank whether she and James were involved. "Yes," Elena said, deciding that honesty was preferable to the strain of continued deception. "We are. Is that going to be a problem?" Margaret studied her for a long moment before shaking her head. "Not for me. I've known James for 10 years and I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. Just be careful, for both your sakes. These kinds of relationships can get messy, and you both have a lot to lose if things go wrong." It was good advice, and Elena took it seriously. She and James established clear boundaries around their professional and personal lives, trying to maintain separation even as they acknowledged the impossibility of keeping the two spheres entirely distinct. They agreed that Elena would never work directly under James's supervision, that she would report to Margaret instead to avoid any appearance of favoritism or impropriety. They agreed that their relationship would not affect Elena's compensation or job security, that if they broke up, she would continue to have a place at Hartwell Industries for as long as she wanted it. These agreements provided structure and protection, but they could not eliminate the fundamental vulnerability that came from loving someone who had power over your professional life. Elena felt that vulnerability acutely in moments when she and James disagreed about work matters, when she had to decide whether to push back against his ideas or accept his judgment, when she wondered whether her professional opinions were being given equal weight, or whether her relationship with him was coloring how he heard her advice. But there were also moments of profound connection, times when Elena felt seen and understood in ways she had never experienced before. James asked about her past, not out of prurient curiosity, but from genuine desire to understand who she had been and what she had survived. He listened to her stories about the scandal and its aftermath without judgment, without trying to fix or minimize her pain, simply holding space for her to speak her truth and be heard. And he shared his own vulnerabilities in return, his fears about whether he was a good leader, his doubts about whether his success was deserved or merely lucky, his loneliness in a life that looked perfect from the outside, but often felt hollow at its core. 6 months into their relationship, James proposed. They were at his apartment on a Saturday evening, cooking dinner together and arguing amiably about the proper way to make risotto, when he suddenly set down his wooden spoon and turned to face her with an expression of such seriousness that Elena felt her heart begin to race. "Marry me," he said, and it was not quite a question, not quite a command, but something in between. A hope expressed as a statement, a desire offered as a possibility. Elena stared at him, the spatula in her hand forgotten, rice threatening to stick to the bottom of the pan while she processed what he had just said. "What?" "Marry me," he repeated, pulling a small box from his pocket and opening it to reveal a ring that was beautiful but not ostentatious, a single diamond in a simple setting that spoke to his understanding of her taste. "I love you. I want to build a life with you. I know it's complicated and messy and there are 1,000 reasons why this might not work, but I also know that I'm happier with you than I've ever been with anyone else, and I don't want to lose that. I don't want to lose you. So marry me, Elena, please." She looked at the ring, at his face, at the life he was offering her. Security, love, partnership, all the things she had thought were lost to her forever. It was tempting beyond measure, and it was terrifying in equal proportion. Marriage to James Hartwell would mean giving up the last vestiges of the protective anonymity she had cultivated, would mean stepping fully into visibility again with all the risks that entailed. But it would also mean committing to him, to this relationship, to the belief that what they had together was worth whatever complications came with it. "Yes," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "Yes, I'll marry you." James slipped the ring onto her finger and kissed her with a joy that was almost boyish in its unguarded enthusiasm, and Elena found herself laughing and crying at the same time, overwhelmed by the strangeness of this life she was living, by the improbability of finding love again after everything that had tried to break her. They married quietly 3 months later, a small ceremony with just close friends and family, no media attention or public spectacle. Elena's mother flew in from Mexico and wept through the entire ceremony, overjoyed to see her daughter happy again after so long. James's parents, older now but still vigorous, welcomed Elena into their family with genuine warmth, and she felt the ache of belonging that came from being accepted, not for what she could offer, but simply for who she was. The wedding was beautiful in its simplicity, held in a garden at sunset, with Eleanor wearing a dress the color of cream and James in a dark suit that made his eyes seem impossibly blue. When they exchanged vows, Eleanor spoke about trust and vulnerability, and the courage it took to love someone when you had been broken before. James spoke about seeing and being seen, about finding in Elena a partner who challenged him to be better than he thought he could be. There was not a dry eye among the guests when they finished, and even Margaret Chen, notoriously unsentimental, dabbed at her face with a tissue. In the year that followed, Eleanor and James built a life together that was both ordinary and extraordinary. She continued working as a translator for Hartwell Industries, her role expanding as the company grew and entered new international markets. James supported her professional development, encouraging her to take on more responsibility, to hire staff, to build a translation department that reflected her vision and expertise. She was good at the work, better than she had remembered being before the scandal, and she took satisfaction in proving to herself that her competence had not been destroyed by what had happened to her. But she also learned to find meaning in the small domestic moments of their life together, cooking dinner on Sunday evenings, arguing about what to watch on television, waking up beside someone who loved her and whom she loved in return. These simple pleasures, which she had taken for granted in her first marriage, now felt precious and hard-won, evidence that she had survived and rebuilt, and found happiness again despite everything that had tried to prevent it. Sometimes, late at night when she could not sleep, Elena would think about that morning when James Hartwell had first spoken to her in the kitchenette of his office building, when she had been just the cleaning woman and he had been the millionaire CEO who joked about giving her his salary if she could translate for him. She thought about how impossible it would have seemed then to imagine that she would end up here, married to him, working alongside him, building a life that incorporated both her past pain and her present joy. The trajectory from that moment to this one was not straight or simple or easy, but it was hers, and she had navigated it with as much courage and dignity as she could muster. One morning, about 18 months after their wedding, Elena arrived at work to find a new cleaning woman pushing a cart through the executive floor. The woman was young, perhaps mid-20s, and she moved through the space with the same determined invisibility that Elena remembered from her own time doing that work. She nodded respectfully when she saw Elena, clearly not recognizing her as someone who had once worn the same uniform and performed the same tasks. Elena watched her for a moment, remembering, and then did something she had not done when she was the one cleaning these offices. She stopped and spoke to the woman, asked her name, thanked her for the work she did. The woman, Maria, she said her name was, looked startled by the attention, as though she was not accustomed to being noticed by the professional staff who occupied these offices. "Your work matters," Elena told her in Spanish, noting the woman's accent and choosing the language that would make her feel most comfortable. "I know it doesn't always seem that way, but it does. And you never know what opportunities might come from doing your work well and with dignity." Maria smiled uncertainly and thanked her, probably thinking Elena was just being kind, not understanding that she was speaking from experience, that she knew exactly what it felt like to be invisible and hoping to be seen. But that was all right. Elena had learned that sometimes the most important things we do are the small kindnesses we offer to others who are where we once were. The gestures that acknowledge their humanity even when the world seems determined to overlook it. She went to her office and settled into her work, translating a complex contract for a Japanese client, her languages flowing as naturally as breath. Through her window, she could see the city spreading out below, the same view James had from his office down the hall. She thought about the life she had built, about the risks she had taken and the fears she had faced, about the man she had married and the career she had reclaimed. It was not a perfect life. Such things did not exist, but it was a good one, earned through perseverance and courage and a refusal to let circumstances define her worth. That evening, Elena left work and met James in the lobby, as they did most days, walking out together as partners in both business and life. On the street, a woman pushing a cleaning cart passed them, heading toward the building for the night shift, and Elena felt a pang of recognition and sympathy for that other life, that other version of herself who had moved through these same streets feeling invisible and defeated. But she was not that woman anymore, and she had James's hand in hers and a home to go to and work that mattered, and the knowledge that she had survived the worst that life could throw at her and emerged stronger for it. That knowledge, more than anything else, was what gave her the confidence to face whatever came next, secure in the understanding that she was more resilient than she had known, more capable than she had believed, more worthy of love and happiness than she had thought possible in those dark months when she had lost everything. The city lights came on as they walked, street lamps and building windows flickering to life in the gathering dusk, and Elena thought about beginnings and endings, about the strange paths that led us from one version of ourselves to another, about the grace required to accept help when we needed it and to offer help when we could. She thought about James's absurd joke that first morning, "I'll give you my salary if you translate this," and how he had ended up giving her so much more than that. Not just money or professional opportunity, but the chance to believe in herself again, to trust again, to love again. "What are you thinking about?" James asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. "About how strange life is," Elena said. "About how the best things often come from the worst moments, if we're brave enough to let them." He squeezed her hand and smiled, understanding what she meant without needing further explanation. That was what partnership meant, she had learned, not the absence of difficulty or complication, but the presence of someone who walked beside you through both, who saw you clearly and loved you anyway, who believed in your capacity to overcome even when you doubted it yourself. They walked home through the darkening streets, two people among millions in the city, ordinary and unremarkable to anyone who passed them. But to each other, they were everything. Proof that second chances existed, that love could bloom even in the most unlikely circumstances, that the courage to be vulnerable was often rewarded with something worth the risk. And if that was not quite the fairy tale ending that stories sometimes promised, it was something better, real, earned, and precious, precisely because of how hard won it had been.